At 75, Carolyn Sutter didn't cry when the Black Elk River swallowed her farm. She didn't cry when muddy water climbed the porch, covered the windows, and nearly reached the roof of the little white farmhouse where she'd spent 53 years beside her husband, Wesley. She cried only once, when she heard her oldest son quietly say, "Mom, there's nothing left to come back to." At first, her children promised they would help. They promised they'd rebuild. They promised she wouldn't face the future alone. But as the flood refused to leave, those promises quietly disappeared. The phone stopped ringing, the visits ended, and one by one, her own family walked away, convinced the land was ruined, the farmhouse was finished, and their 75-year-old mother could never start over. Only Carolyn refused to believe it. As the rescue boat carried her away, she stared across the flood, watching the water cut through one corner of the fields. Almost to herself, she whispered, "That's not where it's supposed to be." No one asked what she meant. Nearly 2 years later, when the water finally pulled back, the old farmhouse was still standing, scarred, broken, but standing, and what investigators uncovered beneath Carolyn's fields would force an entire Missouri county to admit they had misunderstood one quiet woman for decades. By the time her family came back, they weren't asking for the farm. They were begging Carolyn for mercy. The hardest part of Carolyn's story hasn't even begun. Subscribe now, because what happened after the flood changed far more than one family's future. Carolyn Sutter had lived through droughts, hailstorms, bitter Missouri winters, and springs when the Black Elk River climbed so close to its banks that neighbors filled sandbags before sunrise. But never, not once in 53 years, had she seen the river move like this. Standing beneath the porch roof of the little white farmhouse, she watched muddy water race across the lower pasture, swallowing fence posts one after another as if they had never existed. The old cattle gate disappeared, then the gravel lane. By the time the county sirens echoed across Ash Creek, the water was already creeping toward the front yard. Behind her, the screen door opened. Her oldest son, Gavin, stepped onto the porch, rain dripping from the shoulders of his jacket. The rescue crews are on their way. Carolyn never turned around. "I know. They're evacuating everyone along the river." She nodded. "I know." Gavin looked across the fields, then back at his mother. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at her as the woman who had always known what to do. He was looking at someone he believed needed protecting. "Mom," his voice softened, "you don't have to carry this anymore." Carolyn finally looked at him. There was kindness in his eyes, love even, but there was something else. Something she'd never seen before. Certainty. Not certainty that the farm could be saved. Certainty that it couldn't. Within minutes, her daughters, Leanne and Trina, arrived carrying overnight bags they'd packed from inside the house. "We got your medications. I packed a few clothes. The insurance papers are in the truck." Everything happened quickly, efficiently, like people preparing for a move instead of an evacuation. Nobody asked Carolyn what she wanted to take. Nobody asked whether she planned to come back. They simply assumed the flood had already made that decision. A loud knock interrupted the moment. 2 firefighters stood at the porch steps. "We need to leave now." Carolyn glanced past them. The river had crossed the driveway. She quietly reached for her coat, not because she'd given up, but because staying any longer would only place someone else's life at risk. As she stepped off the porch, her hand brushed the weathered railing Wesley had built the summer after they were married. Just one touch, almost like saying goodbye, or perhaps making a promise. She climbed into the rescue boat without another word. The engine rumbled to life. Slowly, the farmhouse drifted farther behind her. Everyone else watched the house. Carolyn watched the water, and almost immediately, she noticed something that made her heart skip. The current wasn't flowing where it was supposed to. The rescue boat eased away from the porch. Slowly, almost reluctantly, rain pounded the river so hard that the water seemed alive, churning across fields Carolyn had walked nearly every day for more than half a century. Her daughters sat beside her in silence. Gavin kept watching the farmhouse disappear behind the rain. Carolyn never looked at the house. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the water. The current should have been cutting straight across the center pasture. Instead, it bent sharply toward the western edge of the property. It slowed near the old cottonwood trees, then curved back toward the creek. Carolyn frowned. That wasn't random. It wasn't how the Black Elk River had ever moved across their farm. Almost without realizing she'd spoken aloud, she whispered, "That's not where it's supposed to be." The firefighter nearest her leaned closer. "What did you say, ma'am?" Carolyn pointed toward the distant tree line. "My husband used to watch that section every spring." No one answered. She continued quietly. "If the river ever got this high, he always said the current would tell us whether the land was still doing its job." The firefighter followed her finger. All he saw was muddy water. To Carolyn, she was looking at 53 years of memories. Weekend after weekend, she and Wesley had walked those fields together, clearing drainage swales, rebuilding small stone outlets, checking culverts after every heavy storm, and arguing over whether another row of native grass should be planted before winter. Neighbors laughed. They said Wesley worried too much. Carolyn simply smiled at the memory. He wasn't afraid of floods. He was preparing for them. The boat reached higher ground, where ambulances, emergency crews, and frightened families crowded the county fairgrounds. People stood wrapped in blankets, staring toward the valley as if hoping the water might suddenly reverse itself. Inside the emergency shelter, a television mounted high on the wall showed live helicopter footage. The camera swept across submerged roads, collapsed barns, and fields that had disappeared beneath endless brown water. Then Carolyn's farmhouse appeared for only a few seconds. A reporter spoke over the images. County officials now believe large sections of farmland may remain inaccessible for many months. Several properties are being classified as total losses. Across the bottom of the screen appeared the words, "Sutter Farm, presumed total loss." Leanne lowered her eyes. Trina reached for Carolyn's hand. Gavin spoke first. "Mom, don't worry about any of this. We'll take care of everything." His sisters quickly agreed. "We'll handle the insurance. We'll figure out what's next. You don't need to think about the farm anymore." The words were meant to comfort her. Instead, they settled quietly in Carolyn's heart. For the first time, her children weren't asking what she wanted. They were deciding what her future would be. Carolyn didn't argue. Not because she agreed, because arguing with fear had never changed anyone's mind. She simply looked back toward the television, toward the flooded valley, toward the farmhouse everyone believed was already gone. Deep inside, one thought refused to leave her. The river had shown her something. Something no one else had seen. She couldn't explain it. Not yet. But as the rain continued falling over Ash Creek, Carolyn quietly realized that the flood wasn't the only thing threatening to take her home. For the first time in her life, she could feel her own family beginning to let go of it too. The flood disappeared from the news long before it disappeared from Carolyn's life. Winter arrived, then spring, yet the roads leading back to the Sutter farm remained blocked behind bright orange barricades and weather-beaten signs that read, "Road closed. Authorized personnel only." Every few weeks, another letter arrived from the county. Another inspection, another delay, another reminder that patience was no longer a choice. Carolyn pinned each notice to the small bulletin board inside the rented trailer. She wasn't counting the days anymore. She was counting the reasons people kept giving her for staying away. At first, her children visited often. Gavin handled the insurance company. Leanne spoke with county offices whenever new reports were released. Trina organized family paperwork and opened a folder labeled Mom's Next Steps. The title made Carolyn pause. She hadn't chosen it. No one had asked whether she wanted one. One Saturday afternoon, all three children gathered around the trailer's tiny kitchen table. Papers covered every inch of it. Insurance estimates, property tax statements, maps of the flooded valley. Carolyn carried in fresh coffee for everyone. Before she could sit down, Gavin looked up from the paperwork. "We've already gone through most of it, Mom." She smiled politely. "Oh? We didn't want you worrying about all these details." Leanne slid another document across the table. "I spoke with a realtor this morning." Carolyn stopped pouring the coffee. "A realtor? Just to understand what options might be available later." "Later? If the county condemns the property," Leanne's voice remained gentle, "we'll already know what to do." "We'll Carolyn noticed the word immediately. Not Yule. Wheel. As though the decision already belonged to everyone, except the woman who had lived there for more than 50 years. She quietly placed the coffee pot on the counter. No one noticed she hadn't poured herself a cup. The conversation continued without her. Insurance deadlines, tax questions, possible buyers, temporary housing, permanent housing. Every sentence assumed the same thing. Carolyn's life after the farm. Not once did anyone ask Carolyn what she believed would happen when the water finally went away. The meeting lasted another hour. Carolyn spoke only twice. Once to answer a question about an insurance policy. Once to ask whether anyone had heard when the county might reopen the road. Neither question changed the conversation. Before leaving, Trina slipped a brochure onto the kitchen counter. Across the front were the words, "Independent Senior Living Communities." "We're not saying you have to do this," she said gently. "We just think it's smart to be prepared." Carolyn folded the brochure without opening it. "I'll keep it." It was easier than arguing. After the trucks disappeared down the road, the trailer became quiet again. Not peaceful, just empty. Carolyn washed the coffee cups, stacked the paperwork into neat piles, and carried the untouched brochure to a kitchen drawer. She wasn't angry. She was hurt. Not because her children wanted to help, but because they'd quietly stopped asking what she wanted. That evening, she pulled one of Wesley's old notebooks from the box beneath her bed. The familiar leather cover felt comforting in her hands. She opened it at random. Rainfall totals, creek levels, drainage checks, simple notes from ordinary days. Near the middle of the notebook, the handwriting changed. It was hers. She turned another page, then another. More entries in her handwriting. Cleared west, swale after spring runoff. Replaced stone at lower outlet. Secondary channel inspected. Flow corrected. Carolyn frowned. She remembered doing the work, but she'd never noticed how much of it had happened after Wesley was gone. She reached for the matching maintenance calendar. The dates lined up. Year after year, the inspections, the repairs, the small jobs everyone overlooked, had continued because she kept doing them. She closed the notebook and rested her hand on the cover. To everyone else, they were chores. To her, they had simply become part of living on the farm. The next morning, another county letter arrived. She opened it before reaching the front door. Property access remains restricted, pending additional safety inspections. No reopening date, no estimate, only another delay. Carolyn slipped the letter into the growing folder. Then she looked back at the notebook still resting on the table. One sentence lingered in her mind. Secondary channel inspected. Flow corrected. She couldn't remember writing it, but she couldn't stop thinking about it either. Somewhere beyond the barricades, beyond the floodwater, something she and Wesley had built was still waiting. And for the first time, Carolyn began wondering if the land remembered more than people did. 22 months after the Black Elk River swallowed the Sutter farm, Carolyn's phone rang just after breakfast. She almost ignored it. Most calls that early were telemarketers. Instead, she picked up. "Mrs. Sutter?" "Yes." "This is the Ash Creek Emergency Management Office." Carolyn slowly set down her coffee. "The county has completed the final safety inspections." She didn't speak. "The road to your property is reopening tomorrow morning." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The woman on the other end gently added, "You'll finally be able to go home." Home. Carolyn hadn't heard anyone call it that in nearly 2 years. After hanging up, she sat quietly at the kitchen table. The coffee had already gone cold. She reached for the telephone again. Her first call was to Gavin. He answered on the third ring. "Mom? The county reopened the road." A pause. "Tomorrow?" "Yes. I wish you would have told me sooner. I've got meetings all day. I only found out 5 minutes ago." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Mom. It's all right. I'll come next weekend." Carolyn smiled. Of course. She made 2 more calls. Leanne had promised her grandchildren a camping trip months earlier. Trina's husband was leaving on a business trip before sunrise. Neither could come. Each apology sounded sincere. Each one hurt exactly the same. By sunset, Carolyn understood something she hadn't wanted to admit. The day she'd waited almost 2 years for she would face alone. Before daylight the next morning, she packed a small cooler, filled a thermos with coffee, and slipped Wesley's old notebook onto the passenger seat beside her. The drive toward the valley felt strangely familiar. The farther she traveled, the quieter the roads became. Entire stretches of highway still carried signs warning of flood repairs. Fresh gravel replaced sections of pavement the river had washed away. When she finally reached the last county barricade, a highway worker stepped aside and waved her through. "Take it slow," he called. "There's still plenty of mud." Carolyn thanked him, then continued down the narrow road she'd driven thousands of times before. Only this time, every mile felt like entering a place she'd once known, but could no longer recognize. The familiar mailbox came first, bent, rusted, half buried in weeds. Carolyn pulled onto what had once been the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. Silence settled around her. No rushing river, no rescue sirens, only the distant call of a meadowlark breaking the morning air. She stepped out slowly. The mud had dried into uneven ridges that cracked beneath her boots. Tall grass pushed through places where truck tires had once worn smooth tracks to the house. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Then she looked up. The farmhouse was still standing. The white paint had faded beneath long stains of dried mud. Several windows were broken. The front porch leaned slightly, and pieces of gutter hung loose along the roofline. It looked tired, wounded, but not defeated. Carolyn walked toward it without hurrying. Every step felt like crossing the distance between two different lives. When she reached the porch, she rested her hand on the weathered railing. The wood was rough, cold, real. She closed her eyes. A gentle smile touched her face. "I kept my promise, Wesley." The words drifted away with the breeze. No audience, no applause. Just a promise, finally fulfilled. She climbed the porch steps carefully. The front door groaned as it opened. Inside, dried mud covered the hardwood floors nearly halfway up the walls. Chairs lay on their sides. Cabinet doors hung open. Family photographs had fallen from the hallway wall, their frames cracked but still recognizable. Carolyn didn't stop to mourn what was ruined. She noticed what had survived. The staircase hadn't shifted. The ceiling beams were straight. The walls showed watermarks, not structural cracks. She quietly nodded to herself. Then she stepped back outside. Something was pulling her toward the western side of the property. She crossed the yard until she reached the shallow drainage swale Wesley had insisted they maintain every spring. Most people would have walked past it. Carolyn knelt beside it. The stone lining was still in place. Leaves and branches covered much of it, but beneath the debris, the channel remained intact. She brushed away a handful of mud, then another. The water had followed it, not perfectly, but enough to slow the force before it reached the farmhouse. Carolyn looked across the fields. The flood hadn't spared the farm. It had followed a path they had spent decades shaping. Her heart began beating faster, not with excitement, with recognition. Just then, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence. A white county pickup rolled into the driveway. A middle-aged man climbed out carrying a clipboard. He looked first at the farmhouse, then across the fields. Before finally noticing Carolyn, "You must be Mrs. Sutter." She nodded. "I'm Daniel Pierce, county structural engineer." He removed his cap and looked back at the house. "I've inspected more than 40 farmhouses since the flood." He paused. "But I've been looking forward to seeing this one." Carolyn studied his expression. It wasn't pity, it was curiosity. Daniel walked a few steps toward the foundation before stopping. He shook his head, almost to himself. "I don't understand it yet." His eyes followed the drainage swale stretching across the field. But this house should not still be standing. Carolyn looked from the engineer to the old stone channel disappearing beneath the grass. For the first time since the flood, she realized someone besides Wesley had finally started asking the same question she had, and somewhere on that battered farm, the answer was waiting. Daniel Pierce remained where he was for another moment, studying the line of weathered limestone disappearing beneath the mud. Then he looked back at Carolyn. "Would you mind walking the property with me?" She nodded. "I was planning to." The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, revealing damage that 2 years of standing water had hidden. The barn had collapsed into a pile of gray timber. Sections of fencing lay twisted against the tree line. Rusted farm equipment sat half-buried beneath layers of dried silt. Yet as they moved farther from the house, Daniel slowed more often. Not because of what had been destroyed, but because of what hadn't. He stopped beside a shallow drainage swale stretching toward the western pasture. The channel was clogged with branches and weeds, but its shape remained almost untouched. Daniel crouched beside it. I've inspected farms where channels like this disappeared completely. Carolyn brushed loose leaves aside with the toe of her boot. We cleaned it every spring. Daniel glanced up. We? She smiled faintly. Wesley and I. They continued walking. 100 yards farther. Daniel paused again. The hillside should have been deeply scarred by rushing water. Instead, rows of native grass still held the soil in place. Not perfectly, but enough to stop the hillside from collapsing. Daniel pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I've seen erosion control projects that failed after one bad storm. He looked across the field. This one didn't. Carolyn quietly answered, it wasn't built for one storm. He looked at her. What do you mean? She rested one hand on a weathered fence post. Wesley never planned for average years. He planned for the year nobody thought would come. Daniel wrote something in his notebook. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. They simply walked. Carolyn knew exactly where each drainage channel should begin, where each stone outlet should end, where water usually crossed the fields after heavy rain. She wasn't following memories, she was following habits. Habits, repeated so many times they had become part of who she was. Near the edge of the lower pasture, Daniel suddenly stopped again. He looked from the drainage swale to the farmhouse, then back toward the creek. Finally he asked, Mrs. Sutter, did anyone ever map this system? Carolyn thought for a moment. I don't know. Then another memory surfaced, not clearly, just enough to make her stop walking. There might have been. She looked toward the farmhouse. If Wesley kept it, I know exactly where he would have put it. Daniel followed Carolyn back toward the farmhouse. The front door still hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Mud covered the floor, but the house felt different now. Less like a ruin, more like a witness. Carolyn walked straight to the small room Wesley had always called his office. Most people would have called it a storage room. An old desk, 2 filing cabinets, shelves lined with weather reports, seed catalogs, and county maps collected over decades. She knelt beside the lower cabinet. The first drawer wouldn't budge. The second finally opened with a sharp scrape. Inside were water-stained folders stacked neatly together. Daniel carefully lifted one onto the desk. The title caught his attention immediately. Drainage Maintenance. Another folder read, Springfield Inspections. Then another. Conservation District Correspondence. Daniel looked at Carolyn. You kept all of these? She shook her head. We did. He opened the first folder carefully. Most pages were damp, but still readable. Inspection dates, hand-drawn sketches, maintenance checklists, small notes written in the margins. Nothing looked extraordinary, until Daniel noticed something. Many pages carried 2 different handwriting styles. One belonged to Wesley, the other appeared again, and again, and again. He looked toward Carolyn. Which one is yours? She pointed without hesitation. The darker ink. Daniel turned several more pages. Almost every inspection completed after Wesley's passing had been signed by Carolyn. He didn't say anything, he simply kept reading. Outside, they returned to the western side of the property. Daniel unfolded one of the sketches beside the drainage swale. He compared the drawing to the land in front of him, then walked several yards uphill, then back again. Finally, he stopped. This isn't just a drainage ditch. Carolyn waited. It's part of a connected system. He followed the sketch with his finger. The swale slows the water. He looked toward the native grasses. The grasses reduce erosion. His eyes moved toward the limestone outlet. And these stone channels redirect the pressure before it reaches the foundation. He slowly lowered the map. This wasn't built one project at a time. No, Carolyn said quietly. It took years. Daniel looked back at the farmhouse standing quietly beyond the trees. For something this extensive, he paused. Someone had to keep maintaining it. Carolyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. The notebooks already had. Daniel carefully rolled the map closed. "I'd like to bring in a soil specialist and a hydrologist." He smiled for the first time that morning. "I think they're going to want to see this." As they started walking back toward the house, Carolyn glanced once more across the western pasture. For nearly 2 years, everyone had looked at the flood and seen destruction. Today, for the first time, someone had looked at the same land and seen evidence. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the edge of Wesley's notebook. Suddenly, another thought came to her. If these folders had survived inside the farmhouse, what else had survived? And more importantly, what was still waiting for someone to find? Daniel Pierce returned 3 days later. This time he wasn't alone. A white SUV pulled in behind his county truck, followed by a pickup bearing the logo of the Missouri Soil and Water Conservation District. 3 people stepped out: a hydrologist, a soil scientist, and a conservation specialist. Carolyn greeted each of them with a handshake. No television cameras, no reporters, just people carrying measuring equipment, maps, and notebooks. Exactly the kind of visitors Wesley would have welcomed. For most of the morning, Carolyn stayed out of their way. She answered questions when they asked them, then let them work. The hydrologist walked the drainage swales with a GPS receiver. The soil scientist dug small samples from several fields. The conservation specialist photographed the limestone channels and carefully measured the spacing between each one. By noon, the group gathered beneath the shade of an old oak tree overlooking the farmhouse. Daniel unfolded an aerial photograph across the hood of his truck. "So?" he asked. The hydrologist spoke first. "The house sits slightly higher than most of the surrounding properties." He pointed toward the ridge. "Elevation probably helped." The soil scientist shook her head. "It helped, but it doesn't explain why the topsoil stayed where it did." She held up a small bag of dark earth. "Most farms downstream lost several inches. This one didn't." The conservation specialist remained quiet. He kept looking from the map to the fields, then back again. Finally, he spoke. "I don't think we're asking the right question." Everyone looked at him. "We're trying to explain why the farmhouse survived." He pointed toward the western pasture. "I think we should be asking why the water slowed down before it reached it." Silence settled over the group. Daniel looked toward Carolyn. She hadn't said a word. He walked over to her. "Mrs. Sutter, you've listened to all of us." She nodded. "What do you think?" Carolyn looked across the fields before answering. "I think you're all studying the flood." She paused. "You should be studying everything that happened before the flood." No one spoke. For the first time that morning, every expert stopped taking notes and simply looked at Carolyn. Daniel broke the silence first. "What happened before the flood?" Carolyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the western drainage swale and stopped beside the weathered limestone lining its edge. She pointed with the toe of her boot. "This wasn't something we built in one weekend." The conservation specialist stepped closer. Carolyn continued. "Every spring, Wesley and I walked this farm after the snow melted. If a stone shifted, we put it back. If a swale filled with silt, we cleaned it. If the grass along the banks started thinning, we replanted it." She looked across the hillside. "We kept doing that year after year." The hydrologist frowned. "Most farms don't maintain systems like this for decades." Carolyn smiled softly. "I know." Daniel unfolded another map across the truck hood. "Mrs. Sutter, you mentioned there might be more records." She nodded. "The filing cabinet wasn't the only place Wesley kept things." "Where else?" "In the attic." Daniel looked toward the farmhouse. "The attic survived?" "I don't know. I never checked." Within minutes, they were back inside the house. The staircase creaked beneath their weight, but it held. Dust floated through beams of sunlight, breaking across the second floor. At the end of the hallway, a narrow pull-down ladder led into the attic. Daniel climbed first. The space smelled of old timber and damp insulation. Most boxes had shifted during the flood, but one wooden storage chest remained wedged beneath a roof beam. Together, they lowered it to the floor. Inside, there were rolled field maps, old aerial photographs, county correspondence, and several weatherproof binders sealed inside heavy plastic sleeves. Daniel carefully opened the first binder. Every page had survived: inspection schedules, maintenance records, hand-drawn sketches showing additions to drainage channels. The dates caught his attention. Most were created after Wesley died. He slowly turned another page, then another. Every update carried the same signature, Carolyn Sutter. Daniel looked up. "I thought you were maintaining his work." Carolyn glanced toward the window overlooking the fields. "So did I." The conservation specialist spread 2 aerial photographs across the floor. One had been taken several years before Wesley's passing, the other nearly a decade later. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Daniel pointed toward the western pasture, the drainage network. His finger traced the lines crossing the property. "It's almost twice the size." He looked directly at Carolyn. "Wesley couldn't have built all of this." She studied the photographs, then quietly shook her head. "No." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He started it." She rested her hand gently on the older photograph. "But I finished it." The room fell silent. For the first time, the experts weren't looking at Carolyn as the widow who inherited a farm. They were looking at the woman who had quietly transformed it. Daniel carefully closed the binder. "I think the county needs to see this." Carolyn looked back toward the attic window. Across the recovering fields, the battered farmhouse stood exactly where it always had. For nearly 2 years, everyone believed the flood had written the farm's final chapter. Now, for the first time, the evidence was beginning to tell an entirely different story. 3 weeks later, Daniel Pierce parked outside the Ash Creek County Administration building with a thick binder tucked beneath his arm. Inside were copies of everything they had found: maintenance logs, field maps, inspection records, aerial photographs, and page after page of Carolyn's handwritten notes spanning nearly 2 decades. Carolyn sat beside him in the meeting room without saying a word. She had spent enough years proving herself through work. Today, the documents would speak. Around the table sat representatives from the county engineering office, the Soil and Water Conservation District, and the Emergency Recovery Committee. Daniel stood first. He carefully laid the aerial photographs side by side. "This," he began, pointing to the older image, "shows the farm before Wesley Sutter's death." His hand moved to the second photograph, and this one was taken 9 years later. The room grew quiet. The drainage network is significantly larger. He opened another folder. The maintenance records correspond with the physical improvements we inspected on site. He paused before looking toward Carolyn. Those improvements were completed and maintained by Mrs. Carolyn Sutter. For several seconds, no one interrupted. Then the county engineer adjusted his glasses. "No one's questioning the records." Daniel nodded. "Then we're in agreement." "Not exactly." The engineer folded his hands. "These are personal journals." He tapped the binder gently. "They're valuable, but they don't establish independent verification." The room fell silent again. Daniel frowned. "You've inspected the property yourselves." "We have." "You've seen the drainage system." "We have." "You've compared the aerial photographs." "We have." The engineer spoke calmly. "What we haven't established is who actually designed, expanded, and maintained the system." Another committee member leaned forward. "If the county officially recognizes work of this scale, we need evidence beyond family records." Carolyn lowered her eyes for a moment, not because she was surprised, because she'd heard those words before. Different people, different room. Same conclusion. We need more proof. It sounded painfully familiar, almost like hearing her children say, "Mom, we think this is what's best." No one was calling her dishonest. They simply weren't ready to believe her. Daniel closed the binder slowly. "So, what kind of proof would satisfy the county?" The engineer answered without hesitation. "Independent records, witnesses, archived inspection reports, anything created by someone outside the Sutter family." For the first time since returning to the farm, Carolyn realized the hardest part of the journey might not be uncovering the truth. It might be convincing everyone else to accept it. The meeting ended without a decision. Chairs slid across the floor, folders closed. One by one, the committee members thanked Carolyn for coming, before quietly leaving the room. No one dismissed her. No one accused her of exaggerating. Yet nothing had changed. Outside, Daniel held the courthouse door open. I'm sorry. Carolyn smiled faintly. What for? I thought the records would be enough. So did I. They stood on the courthouse steps, watching people cross the town square. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel looked at her. The county wasn't saying you're wrong. I know. They're saying they can't prove you're right. Carolyn nodded. There was an important difference, one she understood all too well. She'd spent years watching people mistake a lack of proof for proof that something never happened. Daniel broke the silence. If we can find records created by someone outside your family, everything changes. Carolyn looked toward the old courthouse. There used to be inspectors. Daniel turned. Inspectors? From the Soil and Water Office. They came out every few years. They walked the fields with Wesley. She paused, and after Wesley passed, they walked them with me. Daniel's eyes narrowed. You never mentioned that. I didn't think it mattered. It matters. That afternoon, they drove to the county Soil and Water Conservation Office. Most of the staff had changed over the years. Only one employee remembered hearing about the Sutter farm. She pointed them toward a small brick house on the edge of town. If anyone remembers those inspections, Harold Bennett will. Harold was 83, retired for nearly 15 years. He welcomed them onto his porch with 2 glasses of iced tea before Daniel even explained why they had come. The Sutter place? The old man smiled. I haven't heard that name in a long time. Daniel opened the binder. We're trying to determine who maintained the conservation system after Wesley Sutter died. Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Carolyn. Then he chuckled softly. You're asking the wrong question. Daniel leaned forward. How so? You should be asking, who kept reminding us to come back? Carolyn looked surprised. Harold pointed at her. Her. He laughed again. Wesley knew the land, but Carolyn noticed the changes. If runoff looked different, she called. If a drainage channel shifted, she called. If heavy rain washed out a bank, she already had it marked before we arrived. Daniel reached for his notebook. You remember that clearly? I walked those fields often enough. Harold's smile faded into quiet respect. Most folks think conservation ends when the project's finished. He slowly shook his head. Carolyn understood the real work started afterward. For the first time that day, someone outside the Sutter family had confirmed exactly what the notebook suggested. Daniel looked toward Carolyn. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Harold suddenly leaned back in his chair. Wait a minute. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling as he searched his memory. If the county kept them, there should be photographs. Daniel looked up. Photographs? Harold nodded. We documented nearly every major conservation inspection back then. Before and after pictures. Drainage improvements. Field surveys. He pointed toward the courthouse they had just left. If those boxes weren't thrown away, they're probably sitting in the county archives. Daniel slowly closed his notebook, then looked at Carolyn. Neither of them spoke. They were thinking the same thing. Somewhere inside those archives, the land might finally have its own witness. The county archives occupied the basement of a brick building most people passed without noticing. Daniel signed the visitor log while Carolyn quietly looked around. Metal shelves stretched from one end of the room to the other. Cardboard boxes, rolled engineering drawings, decades of county history stacked in careful rows. A records clerk led them to a section marked Soil and Water Conservation District. Everything from the 70s through the early 2000s should be here, she said, if it wasn't destroyed. Daniel thanked her. Then the search began. The first hour produced very little. Annual reports, budget requests, routine inspection summaries, nothing mentioning the Sutter farm. Carolyn never appeared discouraged. She knew something most investigations required: patience. By lunchtime, Daniel had opened nearly 20 boxes. Still nothing. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. I was hoping we'd be farther along. Carolyn smiled gently. Wesley always said the first place you look is usually where everyone else already looked. Daniel laughed softly. So where would he look? She glanced toward the oldest shelves near the back wall. Somewhere nobody's opened in years. They carried another stack of faded storage boxes to a long wooden table. Dust covered nearly every lid. The labels had almost disappeared. One box simply read, Field Inspections, 1998 to 2004. Daniel carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of inspection folders arranged by township. He worked methodically until one name stopped him, Sutter Farm. He looked up. Mrs. Sutter. Carolyn walked over. He placed the folder on the table between them. The paper had yellowed with age, but the writing remained clear. The first page listed routine inspection dates. Nothing unusual. Daniel turned another page, then another. Suddenly, a small envelope slipped from the folder onto the table. Across the front, someone had written 2 words in faded blue ink, site photos. Neither of them spoke. Daniel slowly opened the envelope. Inside were several printed photographs, still perfectly preserved. He turned over the first one. His eyes widened. Then he looked at Carolyn. I think... You need to see this. Daniel carefully slid the first photograph from the envelope. It showed the western pasture. Not after the flood, but years before it. A younger Wesley stood near the drainage swale, holding a survey rod while another man pointed toward a freshly cut channel. Daniel turned the photograph over. Across the back, stamped in fading black ink, were the words, Missouri Soil and Water Conservation District Official Field Inspection, April 14th. He reached for the next photograph. This one stopped both of them. Carolyn stepped closer. The picture showed the same section of the farm. Nearly 8 years later, Wesley wasn't in it. Instead, Carolyn stood alone beside the limestone channel, work gloves tucked into her back pocket, listening as 2 county inspectors studied a field map spread across the hood of a pickup truck. Daniel looked from the photograph to Carolyn, then back again. This was taken after Wesley passed. She nodded slowly. I remember that day. Another photograph followed. Carolyn knelt beside the drainage outlet while one inspector measured water flow through the stone channel. Another showed her pointing toward the hillside, explaining something to a group of conservation workers. There was no mistaking it. She wasn't standing nearby. She was leading the inspection. Daniel spread every photograph across the table. Each carried an official inspection stamp. Each included dates, locations, inspector initials, independent county records. Exactly the evidence the committee had requested. Neither of them noticed the records clerk walk over. She looked down at the photographs and smiled. I remember these. Daniel looked up. You do? My father worked in this office. She picked up one of the inspection sheets. He used to say there was one farm owner who never waited for the county to find a problem. Her eyes settled on Carolyn. She usually found it first. Carolyn lowered her gaze. She had never imagined anyone remembered. Daniel carefully opened another folder from the same box. Inside were inspection summaries, matching the photographs. One sentence had been underlined decades earlier. He read it aloud. Additional erosion controls completed since previous inspection under the direction of property owner Carolyn Sutter. The room fell silent, not because the words were dramatic, because they were unmistakable. Daniel looked at Carolyn with a smile that hadn't appeared since the investigation began. This is independent verification. He gathered the photographs into careful stacks. The county asked for proof. They just got it. Carolyn gently touched one of the photographs before he placed it back into the envelope. She wasn't looking at herself. She was looking at the fields behind her. The same fields everyone believed had been destroyed forever. Daniel closed the folder. We're taking copies of everything. The records clerk nodded. I'll certify them before you leave. As she disappeared down the aisle, Daniel leaned back in his chair. I think the committee's going to see this very differently. Before Carolyn could answer, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The smile slowly disappeared. It was the county administrator. Daniel answered. He listened without saying a word, then quietly replied, I understand. He ended the call. Carolyn studied his face. What happened? Daniel looked down at the certified photographs spread across the table. The committee moved up the review meeting. To when? He folded the inspection report and slipped it into the binder. Tomorrow morning. He met Carolyn's eyes. And not everyone is happy about what we found. The county meeting room was fuller than it had been 3 weeks earlier. Representatives from the engineering department sat along one side of the table. Members of the Soil and Water Conservation District filled the other. 2 university researchers attended by invitation. Even Harold Bennett had come. Carolyn noticed him first. He tipped his hat with a quiet smile. "You came. I wasn't about to miss this." Daniel placed the certified archive photographs beside the original inspection reports. Nobody spoke while the committee settled into their seats. The county administrator cleared his throat. "Mr. Pierce, you requested this special session." Daniel stood. "I did." He looked around the room before opening the first binder. "At our previous meeting, the committee requested independent verification regarding the conservation work completed on the Sutter farm." He lifted the certified inspection photographs. "We found it." One by one, he placed the photographs on the presentation board. The first showed Wesley supervising an inspection. The second showed Carolyn standing with county technicians years later. The third showed Carolyn pointing toward the western drainage system while inspectors took measurements. Every image carried an official county stamp. Every report matched the dates in Carolyn's notebooks. The room remained silent. Daniel continued. "We also recovered certified inspection summaries." He handed copies around the table. "These documents confirm that after Wesley Sutter's death," he looked toward Carolyn. Mrs. Carolyn Sutter continued expanding, maintaining, and documenting the conservation system herself. The committee members quietly turned the pages. No one questioned the signatures. No one questioned the dates. One university researcher finally spoke. "This is remarkably complete documentation." Another nodded. "It's rare to see records spanning this many years." The county engineer slowly removed his glasses, then looked directly at Carolyn. "Mrs. Sutter, I believe we owe you an apology." Carolyn smiled politely. "You don't owe me one." The room looked surprised. She folded her hands. "You simply didn't know." She paused. "I've spent most of my life working where nobody was looking." Silence. Not uncomfortable. Respectful. Harold leaned back in his chair. "I told you folks years ago. The wrong person was getting all the credit." Several heads turned toward him. He continued, "Wesley was a fine man, but after he died, he pointed gently toward Carolyn. She never stopped." The room became quiet again. Not because anyone disagreed, because for the first time, every piece of evidence, every witness, every photograph, every notebook was telling exactly the same story. The county engineer slowly stood. He picked up one of the certified inspection reports and read it again, before looking across the room. "I've reviewed engineering reports for nearly 30 years. He paused. "I've never seen documentation this complete remain unnoticed for so long." Several committee members nodded. One after another, they compared the inspection reports with the aerial photographs Daniel had arranged across the table. Every date matched. Every inspection lined up. Every improvement recorded in Carolyn's notebooks appeared again in county files, created by people who had no reason to favor her. The evidence no longer depended on memory. It stood on its own. Daniel carefully unfolded the newest aerial map beside the oldest one. "You asked what protected the Sutter farmhouse." He traced the drainage network with his finger. It wasn't one structure. It wasn't one project. It was decades of continuous maintenance. He looked toward Carolyn, and that maintenance continued because Mrs. Sutter refused to let the system fail. A university hydrologist leaned forward. "This changes our entire understanding of what happened during the flood." He pointed toward the western drainage corridor. The water didn't simply avoid the farmhouse. It was slowed, redirected, and released, exactly as this conservation network was designed to do. The room became remarkably still. The county administrator closed the final report. "I believe we have our conclusion." He turned toward Carolyn. "Mrs. Sutter, the county officially recognizes your documented role in expanding and maintaining the conservation system that protected your property." He stopped briefly before adding, "And we will be correcting the public record." For nearly 2 years, every newspaper article, every television report, every county summary had described the Sutter farm as a lucky survivor. Now, luck had officially been replaced by truth. Harold Bennett quietly smiled. "I've been waiting a long time to hear someone say that." A soft laugh moved around the room, not at Carolyn, with her. It was the first time since the flood that she felt something she hadn't realized she'd lost. She wasn't being comforted, she was being respected. As the meeting ended, several committee members walked over to shake her hand. One asked if local schools could visit the farm once restoration was complete. Another suggested the property could become a demonstration site for future flood-resilient farming practices. Daniel simply stood back and watched. He remembered the first day he met Carolyn, a quiet widow standing beside a damaged farmhouse while everyone else saw destruction. Today, an entire room of professionals had begun seeing what she had seen from the beginning. As Carolyn gathered her notebook, movement near the back of the meeting room caught her attention. The door had opened quietly sometime during the presentations. Standing just inside, unsure whether to come farther, was Gavin. He hadn't spoken, he hadn't interrupted. He had heard enough. Mother and son looked at each other across the room, for the first time since the rescue boat pulled away from the farmhouse. Neither of them looked away, but the expression on Gavin's face wasn't pride, it was regret, and Carolyn knew. He hadn't come to congratulate her. He had come because he finally understood what his family had lost, long before the flood ever reached the farm. The story spread through Ash Creek faster than Carolyn expected. By the end of the week, the county had issued a public correction acknowledging her role in designing, expanding, and maintaining the conservation system that had protected the Sutter farm. The local newspaper devoted nearly an entire front page to the story. The farm that survived, and the woman who made it possible. The article didn't focus on the flood, it focused on Carolyn, her years of quiet work, the notebooks, the county inspection photographs, the records that had finally told the truth. By Saturday morning, copies of the newspaper sat on coffee tables, diner counters, and feed store benches across the county. Gavin read it during his lunch break. He reached the paragraph describing the months after the flood and quietly stopped reading. The reporter had written, while many believed the farm had been lost, Carolyn Sutter continued preserving the records that ultimately explained why it survived. He stared at the page for a long time. He remembered something else instead. The afternoon he'd placed an assisted living brochure on his mother's kitchen table. He hadn't asked what she wanted. He'd assumed he already knew. Across town, Leanne folded the same newspaper after reading it twice. Her eyes settled on a photograph of Carolyn, standing beside the restored drainage swale. She remembered telling her mother, "You don't need to think about the farm anymore." At the time, she'd believed she was easing her mother's burden. Now, she wondered if she'd only made it heavier. That evening, Gavin drove toward the farmhouse alone. The porch light glowed softly against the fading sunset. His truck remained parked in the driveway for several minutes before he finally climbed out. When he reached the porch, he found Carolyn sitting quietly in Wesley's old wooden swing. She looked up and smiled. "Hello, Gavin." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in his life, he couldn't find the words. Carolyn motioned toward the empty chair beside her. "Sit down." Gavin lowered himself into it, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. For several moments, the only sound came from the evening breeze, moving through the maple tree Wesley had planted decades earlier. Finally, Gavin spoke. "Mom." His voice caught. "I've practiced this conversation 100 times. Carolyn waited. "I don't think any of those words were the right ones." She smiled gently. "They don't have to be." He looked across the fields before continuing. "When the flood came, I honestly believed I was protecting you. I know. I thought the farm was gone. So did a lot of people." He shook his head. "That's not the part I can't forgive myself for." Carolyn remained silent. "I stopped asking what you wanted." His eyes filled. "I started making decisions, because I thought I knew better." The words hung quietly between them. Carolyn looked toward the western pasture, where the afternoon sun rested across the restored drainage swale. Then she answered, "I never expected you to save the farm." Gavin turned toward her. "But I did need you to believe I still deserved a voice." He lowered his head. "I took that away." A tear slipped down his cheek before he wiped it away. "I didn't even realize I was doing it." Carolyn reached over and rested her hand on his. "I know." A car door closed somewhere behind the house. Both of them turned. Leanne stood near the driveway, holding a small paper bag. She walked slowly onto the porch. "I wasn't sure if I should come." Carolyn stood and embraced her before she could say another word. Leanne opened the bag and placed something on the porch table. The folded assisted living brochure. Its edges were worn from being carried for nearly 2 years. I kept meaning to throw this away. She looked at her mother. But I never could. Carolyn picked it up. She studied the cover for a moment, then folded it closed again. You know why you held on to it? Leanne quietly shook her head. Because you loved me. She paused. But somewhere along the way, you confused protecting me with replacing me. Leanne covered her face. I'm so sorry, Mom. Before Carolyn could answer, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Trina stepped out slowly. She wasn't carrying flowers or gifts, only a single manila folder. She handed it to Carolyn. I need you to have this. Inside was a listing agreement, unsigned, prepared almost 2 years earlier. The date stopped Carolyn cold. It had been drafted before the county even reopened the road. I contacted a realtor. Trina's voice trembled. I never signed it, but I was ready to. She looked across the farm. I'd already decided there wasn't anything worth coming back to. Carolyn closed the folder without a word. The 3 children stood together, waiting, not for forgiveness, for truth. Carolyn looked at each of them before speaking. The flood took my home for a while. She let the silence settle. But the hardest thing I lost was knowing my own children still trusted my judgment. No one tried to explain. No one defended the past. There was nothing left to defend. The evening breeze swept gently across the fields. For the first time since the rescue boat carried Carolyn away, her family finally understood that the deepest damage had never been caused by the river. And as the last light settled over the farmhouse, Carolyn quietly looked toward the porch, where Wesley had once told her that a home became valuable because people refused to give up on it. Tomorrow, she would tell her family what she'd already decided about the future of the farm, and it would change all of their lives forever. The announcement came quietly, without television cameras, without speeches, without anyone trying to turn it into something bigger than it was. Carolyn preferred it that way. On a bright September morning, county officials, representatives from the Missouri Soil and Water Conservation District, university researchers, and several neighboring farmers gathered beneath a large white tent overlooking the western pasture. The same pasture everyone once believed had been destroyed forever. Now, rows of folding chairs faced the farmhouse. The porch had been repaired. Fresh white paint covered the weathered clapboards. Flower boxes rested beneath the front windows once again. The scars of the flood hadn't disappeared, but neither had the farmhouse. Some things don't become beautiful because they escape hardship. Sometimes they become beautiful because they survive it. Daniel Pierce stepped to the small wooden podium. He looked across the crowd before speaking. Nearly 3 years ago, many of us stood on this very road, believing this farm had reached the end of its story. He paused. We were wrong. He turned toward Carolyn. We believed we were looking at a remarkable flood. In truth, we were looking at the result of remarkable stewardship. A gentle round of applause spread through the audience. Carolyn lowered her eyes for a moment. She had never worked for applause. The county administrator unfolded a framed certificate. Today, Ash Creek County officially recognizes Carolyn Sutter for decades of documented conservation leadership and land stewardship. He smiled. But recognition alone isn't why we're here. He stepped aside. Behind him stood a wooden sign covered with a canvas cloth. 2 local 4-H students walked forward and carefully lifted it away. The audience immediately applauded. The sign read, "The Sutter Stewardship Farm, a Missouri demonstration farm for conservation, flood resilience, and sustainable agriculture." Carolyn stared at the sign for several seconds. Not because her family's name appeared on it, but because Wesley's lifelong dream had finally found a future. There are moments when life quietly returns everything hardship tried to take. Not all at once. One truth at a time. The university's agriculture dean stepped forward next. We're honored to partner with Mrs. Sutter. He looked toward the field stretching beyond the farmhouse. Our students won't simply study conservation from textbooks. They'll study it here, on land where patience, discipline, and long-term stewardship proved stronger than disaster. Another document was placed before Carolyn. This one wasn't honorary. It was practical. A long-term stewardship agreement, The university would fund annual maintenance of the drainage system. The county would assist with preservation. Carolyn would serve as the farm's senior stewardship advisor, receiving an annual stipend to teach workshops, guide restoration efforts, and mentor future landowners. Not a reward, an opportunity. The years she spent doing unnoticed work had finally become work no one wanted to lose. People often think the greatest reward for faithfulness is recognition. Sometimes, the greater reward is discovering your quiet work can keep helping people long after they know your name. Daniel leaned toward Carolyn. I guess retirement will have to wait. She laughed softly. I don't think I was ever very good at retiring. The crowd laughed with her, not at her, with her. It was a small difference, but one Carolyn had learned never to underestimate. As the ceremony ended, young farmers gathered around the demonstration maps Daniel had arranged beside the porch. Questions came from every direction. How often should drainage channels be inspected? What kind of grass holds soil best? How do you know when runoff is changing? Daniel answered a few. Then he looked toward Carolyn. I think they're asking the wrong person. The group turned. For a moment, Carolyn hesitated. Old habits are hard to silence, especially after years of believing no one wanted to hear your voice. Then she walked toward them, smiling, ready to teach. And standing quietly near the back of the crowd, watching every step she took, were Gavin, Leanne, and Trina. None of them had come to celebrate the farm. They had come for something far more important. Today, they intended to ask their mother for something they should have asked for long ago. The last visitors left just before sunset. University students folded the demonstration maps. County officials shook Carolyn's hand one final time before driving away. Soon, only the farmhouse remained, and the family. The evening light stretched across the western pasture, turning the fields golden. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sometimes silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's where the truth finally finds enough courage to appear. Gavin was the first to step forward. He didn't stop on the porch. He walked all the way to his mother. Then, without saying a word, he removed his cap. It was a gesture Carolyn hadn't seen since Wesley's funeral. Mom. His voice was steady. I've been waiting to say this. He looked down at the porch floor. But every time I tried, it sounded too small. Carolyn waited. I thought I was protecting you. He swallowed hard. I didn't realize I was replacing you. The words hung quietly between them. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Gavin slowly lifted his eyes. I stopped asking what you wanted, because I thought I already knew. A quiet breeze moved across the porch. Regret often arrives years after certainty has already done its damage. I can't change that. His voice trembled. But he took one slow breath. Can you find it in your heart to forgive me? The words settled over the porch with surprising gentleness. There it was. Not pride, not excuses, only humility. Carolyn stepped closer. She rested one hand against his cheek, the same way she had when he was a little boy afraid of thunderstorms. I forgave you long before today. Gavin closed his eyes. But forgiveness doesn't erase yesterday. She smiled warmly. It gives tomorrow somewhere better to begin. He nodded. Unable to speak, behind him, Leanne quietly walked forward. She wasn't carrying flowers. She wasn't carrying gifts. Only a worn envelope. She handed it to Carolyn. Inside was the assisted living brochure. Still folded, still unopened. I couldn't throw it away. Leanne looked toward the farmhouse. Every time I tried, I remembered the look on your face. Carolyn folded the brochure once more before slipping it back into the envelope. You weren't trying to get rid of me. Leanne wiped away a tear. No, I was trying to protect you. Carolyn nodded. I know. She gently took her daughter's hands. But never mistake someone's age for the end of their purpose. Leanne lowered her head. I won't. A few feet away, Trina stood quietly, holding the same manila folder she'd brought weeks earlier. She opened it, then removed the unsigned listing agreement. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges. I almost sold your future before I even knew whether there was one. She looked directly at her mother. I don't expect you to understand. Carolyn answered almost immediately. I do understand. That surprised all three of them. When people become afraid, they usually rush toward certainty. She glanced across the recovering fields. But life has taught me something different. The strongest decisions are usually the ones made after we're willing to listen. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to defend, only something left to rebuild. Then, for the first time since the flood, all three children stood together before their mother, not asking for the farm, not asking for money, not asking for another chance to make decisions, simply asking for mercy. Carolyn looked at each face, faces she had loved long before they knew how to disappoint her. Then she quietly opened her arms. The embrace wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect. Families rarely heal in a single moment, but they can begin healing in one honest one. Sometimes the bravest words aren't "I was right." Sometimes they're simply "I was wrong." And sometimes the greatest act of strength isn't holding on to hurt. It's refusing to let hurt become the family inheritance. As they stood together on the porch, the evening wind carried the sound of children laughing somewhere near the western pasture. Carolyn looked toward the fading sunlight, then quietly said, "Come with me. There's one more thing I want all of you to see." The three children followed, not because she was their mother, but because, after everything they had witnessed, they had finally learned to trust where she was leading them. Carolyn led her family down the narrow path toward the western pasture. No one walked ahead of her. For years they had assumed she needed someone to lead the way. Now, without a word being spoken, they naturally followed. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay as they reached the drainage swale. The same stretch of land that had puzzled engineers, filled university notebooks, and quietly protected the farmhouse when the river came. Carolyn stopped beside the limestone channel. She knelt slowly and brushed away a few fallen leaves. The stones beneath were exactly where she'd placed them years earlier. She smiled. They're still doing their job. Her youngest grandson stepped closer. "Grandma, were these here when Grandpa was alive?" Carolyn nodded. "Some of them." She rested her hand on one of the larger stones. "Your grandfather taught me how to place the first ones." She looked farther down the channel. "We placed the rest together." Then she smiled again, and after he was gone, I kept placing them. The little boy looked across the winding channel. "So nobody would see them?" A soft laugh escaped Carolyn. "No. So the water would." Everyone smiled. Sometimes the greatest work in life is never meant to be noticed, only to be there when it's needed most. Daniel and several university students quietly approached from a respectful distance. One student carried a notebook, another held a camera. Daniel looked toward Carolyn. "Would you mind showing them how you knew the water would turn?" Carolyn glanced at the children beside her, then at the students waiting patiently. She nodded. "Come closer." Soon, they formed a loose circle around her. Instead of giving a lecture, Carolyn picked up a small stick and drew a simple line in the dirt. "This is the river." She drew another line. "This is where everyone expected the water to go." Then she curved the line gently toward the swale. But water follows the easiest path. She tapped the limestone beneath her boot. If you spend enough years helping the land eventually remembers. The students wrote quickly. Daniel didn't. He simply listened. Knowledge becomes wisdom only after someone lives it long enough to understand why it matters. One young farmer raised his hand. "What was the most important thing you ever learned?" Carolyn looked across the recovering fields before answering. It wasn't about water. It wasn't even about farming. The group waited. She smiled. Small things, done faithfully, have a way of saving lives years later. No one wrote immediately. The words settled first. Then the pens began moving. Gavin looked toward the drainage channel. "I walked past this hundreds of times." "So did I," Leanne whispered. Trina shook her head, "and I never asked why it was here." Carolyn looked at her children with kindness. "We all overlook things." She paused. "The important part is deciding what we'll pay attention to from now on. Life rarely changes because we suddenly know more. It changes because we finally begin noticing what has been there all along." Just then, her oldest granddaughter stepped beside her. "Grandma, will these stones still be here when I'm old?" Carolyn looked down at her, then toward the farmhouse standing proudly against the evening sky. They will. She smiled. As long as someone remembers why they matter. The little girl slipped her hand into Carolyn's. I'll remember. Carolyn squeezed it gently. So will I. The evening sun settled lower across the valley. Behind them, the farmhouse stood stronger than anyone had believed possible. Ahead of them, a new generation stood quietly learning lessons no classroom could ever fully teach. And for the first time since the river changed all of their lives, the future felt every bit as strong as the foundation beneath their feet. As the evening settled over the valley, Carolyn walked one last time toward the western drainage swale. This time, she wasn't alone. Her grandchildren hurried beside her, carefully stepping from stone to stone as the shallow stream whispered through the channel. The youngest stopped and looked up. "Grandma, can you teach us how the water turned?" Carolyn smiled. "I can." She knelt beside the limestone lining the swale and gently rested her hand against one of the stones. "Your grandfather taught me something a long time ago. He said, the land is always speaking. You just have to care enough to listen." The children leaned closer, not because they had to, because they wanted to. Carolyn looked across the fields where golden light stretched toward the old farmhouse. "For years, we moved these stones. We cleared these channels. We planted grasses. We repaired little things." She smiled softly. Most days, it didn't seem important, but one day, it became the reason this home was still standing. Life has a way of proving that the smallest acts of faithfulness often become the strongest foundations for tomorrow. The oldest granddaughter looked at the winding channel. "So the flood didn't save the farm?" Carolyn gently shook her head. "No, the flood revealed what had been quietly protecting it all along." Those words lingered in the evening air, not just for the children, but for every adult standing nearby. Sometimes people spend so much time looking for extraordinary answers that they overlook the ordinary habits quietly shaping extraordinary lives. Gavin stepped beside his mother. "We almost lost more than this farm." Carolyn looked at him. "Yes, we almost lost each other." He nodded. "But we found our way back." Carolyn smiled. "Because we finally started listening. No family is perfect. The strongest ones simply choose not to let pride have the final word." The grandchildren ran ahead toward the farmhouse, laughing as they followed the path beside the swale. Carolyn watched them for a moment before slipping Wesley's old notebook into her oldest granddaughter's hands. The little girl looked surprised. "Grandma, what if I make mistakes?" Carolyn smiled. "You will? We all do." She gently closed the notebook. "But if you keep learning, keep listening, and keep showing up, you'll leave things better than you found them." The little girl hugged the notebook tightly. "I promise." Carolyn believed her. She looked one last time toward the farmhouse. The porch, where she had once believed she was saying goodbye. The fields everyone thought were beyond saving, and the family that had finally found its way home. The river had receded long ago, but the greatest thing it left behind wasn't richer soil or a stronger farmhouse. It was a family that finally understood the value of the woman they had almost stopped hearing. And perhaps that's a lesson worth carrying into our own lives. Before we decide what's best for someone we love, let's first make sure we've truly listened to them, because sometimes the strongest people are the quiet ones. The wisest voices are the oldest ones, and the greatest legacies are built through small acts of faithfulness repeated over a lifetime. If Carolyn's journey touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone underestimated simply because of their age? Or have you experienced it yourself? Share your story in the comments below, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories of resilience, family, forgiveness, and late-life comebacks, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for our next unforgettable journey. Until next time, take care of the people who once spent a lifetime taking care of you.